probably, it's a very turbulent time to be a journalist, as you're probably all aware. I'm not going to start to talk about Levis, and I think that's probably been very well discussed by everyone else, and you can get that from other news sources. It might be useful to give you some kind of background about my own experience working as a journalist. I've been involved in investigative, more detailed, more analytical work for about the past 10 years. Before that, I would have been doing the kind of news coverage that you just see in your bulletins and your standard news programs every evening, or the newspapers that you pick up, just day-to-day news, and strangely covering the sorts of stories that I think we're seeing unfolding over the past week and a half. Conflict on the streets, quite depressing, but as a young cub journalist, you do a lot of churn in terms of the news stories you do, and you get to understand why the industry works in the way it does and how strings are pulled in the way that they do. So as a result then, whenever you move into the more investigative work, you have a better understanding of how information is managed and how it flows and where to get information, and how, I suppose in a way, how stories and complex stories of the sorts that perhaps maybe interest this kind of an audience here can get lost in the day-to-day news agenda. One example of that would be about 5 years ago, we did a piece for RTE. It had really been about a year and a half in the making in terms of whenever we first identified the story, and it was about a form of DNA technology, DNA fingerprinting technology, that it turned out fell short of the sorts of expectations that the public at large like to think that DNA fingerprinting is capable of absolutely definitive answers. In fact, we were able to say this wasn't the case, and we were able to provide an example of a case where it seemed that somebody was guilty of a sexual offence. It was a case that hadn't been prosecuted. It was a very, very high-profile case in the Republic of Ireland, and there was quite an outcry over why this hadn't happened. So as a result of the work that we had been able to do in the previous 18 months or so, we were able to put together a short piece that was broadcast on primetime TV. It was very well received. It was an interesting piece because it tackled a difficult subject, an unpopular subject, in that it exploded particular myths and comfortable myths that people quite like to have. But at the same time, there was a receptiveness towards it because people did want answers. So that was an example of where investigative work can be well received, where there is a mass audience for it, but it does also demonstrate, I think, some of the requirements of investigative journalism, and that is the ability to have the time to delve into a subject, to be able to reach out to particular contacts, the people who actually know the subject well, and for them to be able to trust you, for them to be able to share all the information that is required for you to get the full picture, the picture in the round, so that whenever you're presenting it to a mass audience, they will get it too. And there's not going to be the same danger that you're going to get something wrong, or that there's going to be a point somewhere along the way that's going to be lost. One of the key figures who featured in the piece that we did was the well-known barrister Michael Higgins. And one of the points that he made was his frustration as a lawyer in seeing the sorts of stories, the sorts of cases that he's dealing with all the time, just, important information, important elements, the key elements, as he would see it, getting lost. And it was essentially, as he said, sometimes the media loses sight. It doesn't want to know about the nitty-gritty. It doesn't want to know about the detail, but actually it's the devil is in the detail. That's where it matters. So whenever the opportunity came for us to set up the website, an investigative news and current affairs website specifically for Northern Ireland, it seemed an obvious title was to call it The Detail. So that's why we have The Detail TV, and that's why we have the title that we do. So as I say, the key points about what it is that investigative journalism needs: you need access to information, you need access to people who are willing to help, and their time and their generosity, and access to the information that they have access to. You need a nurturing environment. I was very lucky as an investigative journalist, whenever I first started moving into this field, to join the UTV Insight team at a time when UTV Insight was a very strong brand. It was a fully dedicated investigative current affairs unit inside UTV. It had a very strong leader in the form of Trevor Burney, who subsequently I went to form the production company Below the Radar with, I should say that. Other members of the team is the estimable Mr. Moore, who's following me, I think, after this talk as well. So some very, very capable, very well established, and very, very dedicated journalists. Now, UTV has since, I think, scaled back And now I think Mr. Moore is obviously back working for UTV again as well, but it's a much scaled back venture in terms of its current affairs output. Basically the detail was formed to kind of fill the gap of providing plurality, of providing an additional independent source of news and current affairs, having the capability of good, strong journalists, people, a mix of experienced journalists and also hungrier, younger journalists who want to learn how to do this kind of thing and who also, again, need the time. So we've been very lucky to be given a platform to do that. And I think, I'd like to think that we've had some successes that do seem to have achieved. But maybe sort of, again, helped some people maybe just to recalibrate the way they think about subjects that they kind of maybe before thought that they knew about. So one of the things that I have found that has changed from whenever I was a young journalist, whenever I was that cub over 20 years ago to today, has been the difficulty in getting information, the critical information that's needed to get that picture in the round so that when you bring it to present it to an audience, you are confident that this is the full picture, that there aren't any gaps in your knowledge here, there's not a big fat fact that's missing somewhere. And our experiences would be, it led us to set up a feature called Waiting, which we had on the site at one stage, which we just felt that kind of described best how information is being managed in Northern Ireland today. And it's basically our experiences of trying to get answers, particularly from state agencies, and having incredible difficulty. So one of them, for example, would be we have some expertise and some interest in looking at accountability where there have been instances of kind of medical mishaps. And there's a system that you may or may not know about where, for example, where things have gone wrong in a hospital environment, particularly in any sort of a healthcare environment, where an investigation is carried out into what's known as a serious adverse incident, an SAI. So one of my colleagues, Catherine Torney, just decided to find out a bit more about it and just looked for anonymised accounts of serious adverse incidents. That was back in July 4th, 2011. It took until, there's a list, I have a list here, essentially, of different cases and different dates where emails and phone calls have been made. Now, under the Freedom of Information Act, that information should be given up within 20 days. And there can maybe be room for some discussion over how it should be dealt with, maybe how the request can be narrowed down. But it should be about 20 days. I think probably our experience has been, I would say, maybe a quarter of Freedom of Information requests that we have submitted have been answered within that time. In truth, probably the number of Freedom of Information requests that are fully answered, I would say it's maybe about 5% of the Freedom of Information requests. So that was a request that went in July 2011. The response came back in October. Finally, that's whenever that information was finally released. And in essence, that's a lot of energy and a lot of effort that's been expended trying to extract information which we would argue is very clearly in the public interest, because all of these cases were deaths. Now, it's not saying that they were caused by direct medical malpractice, and it was actually in a lot of the cases it wasn't clear exactly what had happened, but it was clear that there were incidents where healthcare professionals had certainly a case to answer. There had been some kind of a failure within the system, and yet this was something that was completely locked away, and we had to fight and fight and fight to extract that from the system. So in some ways, we kind of started to move away a little bit from the standard Freedom of Information request, looking at original documents such as emails and the like. Again, my colleague Catherine Torney has started to build up substantial experience in using data, which I think that the authorities are more willing to give up because it doesn't directly implicate any particular individuals. It is what it sounds like, it is data instead as well too, but it can still flag up very, very relevant issues. So on the same field, another colleague now, McCracken, decided to look at the use of confidentiality agreement in the settlements of medical negligence cases. Again, it looks like a fairly dreary subject matter on the face of it. We believe it's again in the spirit of the detail that in fact it goes to the heart of secrecy within the medical establishment. And what's interesting about this, I would argue, is that between this is the most recent batch of cases which have been settled or cases which have been completed within the public healthcare system here. 10 years ago, the Audit Office recommended that there should be no confidentiality agreements because they were connected to the spending of public money in a public resource and in a field particularly where there should be learning, where there have been mistakes, where there have been errors, and yet this case particularly showed that there is a prevalence, there is a tendency still for these things to be concealed fundamentally in whatever shape or form. So those are the sorts of questions, but again, it's trying to penetrate those walls. You tend to actually find yourself actually hitting the process. It's the process is the problem more often than not. So that's as far as medical negligence cases is concerned. Another field that we've acquired interest in, and again, where institutionally the style of concealment is quite difficult to explain, and some of it is medical negligence. I think is difficult because it's seen as being nearly hostile to the NHS. That could be the problem with it, whereas in fact it's quite the opposite. You know, the spirit of what we do is very much about providing the best possible, is providing an argument in a safe place for a discussion about the best possible public healthcare system. And I think there's also a difficulty because we all like to feel safe within the NHS. It's a difficult kind of a conversation to have, particularly if it looks like you're attacking doctors and nurses as well, which obviously isn't the spirit of these things. In another field where there's difficulty in terms of trying to tell the story about what's going on behind the scenes, it's already been alluded to by Professor Scraton earlier. In fact, it's one of he's very much the expert in this field, but it's about prisons. What happens inside prisons? How do you find out what happens inside prisons in Northern Ireland? It's very difficult if you actually try and sit down to work out how do you get information about the welfare of prisoners or about what's being done to help rehabilitate them. Actually trying to get answers, I think if you look at it, you'll find that an awful lot of what happens is inclined to be, it's leaks from prison officers. But actually trying to find out directly from the prisoners themselves is quite a different story, and particularly for journalists. So again, we have, another one of my colleagues, Barry McCaffrey, on a hunch, went looking for information using the data method recently. And he discovered this about solitary confinement in Highbank Wood Prison had doubled. And the thing that was interesting about this, whenever Barry uncovered this data, it turned out that practically nobody else knew about it. The Prison Service didn't know about it. The Prisoner's Ombudsman didn't know about it as well too. It was Barry McCaffrey and his work that uncovered that this was happening, that this phenomenon was happening. And I just think it's interesting because some of this says a lot about the fact that there really is it's very difficult for prisoners' voices to get heard, and for them to get a fair hearing in that sense. So, I mean, for example, whenever we were trying to do further background research and reach into some of the people who are involved in providing pastoral care inside the prison system, one of the things that we were told by one of them was that he would love to talk about many of the things that he saw inside the prison, but in fact, part of his contract with the Prison Service was that he was expressly prohibited from speaking to the press. And I just think that's extraordinary, and that's very different from the kind of environment in which I started off as a young journalist about 25 years ago, where in fact, as a journalist, whenever you made an approach to an organisation, you were given your place as a journalist, your role as providing a public service was recognised, and you were given a particular sort of access. It's now the complete opposite. Your path is blocked at every avenue. So going back to the detail and the sorts of things that you find yourself dealing with today, I mean, I just think, again, the past week has been quite an instructive one. We've seen, unfortunately, conflict return to the streets. And we've seen, this is kind of, it's been happening, it's been flaring up with parades and different things as well, too. It's kind of this idea that, I suppose because there's been so much misbehaviour on the part of the press, and particularly the red tops, that journalists are basically seen as being creatures who just misbehave and who have to be controlled and have to be contained in some shape or form. But I mean, I think if you do want to ask yourself the questions, okay, what's exploded on the streets here over the past week or so, did anybody really see that coming? Was there any indication that anybody was actually tapped into what was happening in those communities, that that level of anger spilled out in the way that it did? Or, for example, if you're curious as to what's happening, you mightn't exactly find the conversation a particularly pleasant one, but I mean, do you know where things are within the dissident Republican population at all? I mean, I think the thing is that, you know, conversations and the sorts of coverage that you might have seen about 15 to 20 years ago, which would have been possible because journalists had contacts inside, whether it was various organisations or various constituencies, have essentially fallen away. And much of that is because the journalists themselves know that they will find themselves a subject, or the subject of unwelcome attention from the criminal justice system as a result of any research that they're doing to try to find out what's going on inside unsavoury organisations. And there's very little support for them whenever it comes to trying to defend the right for them to get information in the round, to present to the public, to give them as full a picture as possible. So there have been sort of various cases over the past few years that I'm sure we've all seen come and go over about the past 4 or 5 years. There's Suzanne Breen. We're seeing it happening to some extent with Boston College. And there was one as well too, and it practically just came and went in the past few days. But press photographers who were covering, who covered the Ardoyne riots in the summer are being forced to hand over their photographs. And one of the things that's kind of quite interesting about the judgments, I've got this from the court service earlier today, the judgment from last Friday, is that there was a differential was drawn between the camera operators who stood behind police lines, the argument being that therefore they couldn't see any more than the police already had, and the photographers, the press photographers, who in fact were operating independently and operating a separate space as well too. And it's the people who fell into that second category are the ones that are being told that they have to hand over their pictures. One of the things that's that does strike me as interesting on the part of the decision that was handed down by the judge was one of the concerns that had been set out in a previous judgment by the court in Strasbourg was that measures taken by national authorities are capable of discouraging the press from disseminating information on matters of legitimate public concern. But his judgment, his decision as far as this was concerned in this case, which happened last Friday and received practically no coverage, was there is no evidence to suggest that the press is in any way disinhibited from reporting news or pursuing investigative stories. So, with that thought, I shall leave you to contemplate the future news coverage that you should be watching of these events over the next, as they unfortunately will probably continue to unfold over the next few weeks. So, thank you very much. Thanks for your time.